with that very thing. And so entitlement management introduces to Entra the concept of an access package, an access package. That package is going to be a bundle of all the resources with the access a user needs to work on a project or perform their task. And so those access packages are used to govern access for your internal employees as well as users outside of your organization. And so you can manage user resources with entitlement management. And so with an access package, you can manage things like the membership in Entra security groups, the membership of Microsoft 365 groups or teams, assignment to enterprise applications in Entra, like SaaS apps, custom integrated applications that support single sign-on or federation, even membership of SharePoint Online sites. But you can also control access to other resources that rely upon Entra security groups or Microsoft 365 groups. So, for example, you can provide licenses to Microsoft 365 by using an Entra security group in an access package and configuring group-based licensing for that group. You can also allow access to manage Azure resources by using an Entra ID security group in an access package, and then creating an Azure role assignment for that group. You can also access, this will provide you access to manage the Entra ID roles by using groups assignable to Entra ID roles in an access package and assigning an Entra ID role to that group. So the access package is exactly what it sounds like. It is a package of access. Groups, apps, sites, policies, all rolled into one and assignable. Now, Microsoft Teams allows users to work with people both inside and outside of your organization, like partners or vendors, suppliers, consultants even. So in looking here at this image, we see user A, right? So user A, it's a member of our organization, our Entra ID organization called Contoso. And so then we have that one user, and then we've got these other external users, right? So user B is a user with a business account in another Entra environment. User C is a user with a consumer email account, right? So they're sitting there with their social identity, perhaps an Outlook.com account or something like that. User D, anonymous user that has not been authenticated against any sort of authentication store that we trust. So like anonymous users can join Teams meetings via a link without having to log in with their Microsoft or organization account. Okay, so very real world stuff here. Now, there are two options to collaborate and communicate with authenticated users outside of your organization when using Teams. Right, so you'll notice here, we've got this Entra ID environment for Contoso and an Entra ID environment for Fabricam, and Fabricam being external to the Contoso configuration. Okay, so we could take advantage of federation. So for external access, this will enable access permissions to users of an entire external domain. Okay, so external access is going to be a type of federation that allows users to find, call, chat, and even set up meetings with people in other organizations, right? So that's what we got going on here. So because we've set up this federation, the user B that's over here gets authenticated with their Entra environment, right? And so this Entra environment doesn't care about who gets signed in and managing the logins and stuff over here. Not our problem. That's part of what Fabricam deals with. The users from Fabricam, however, once they get signed in, can now start finding, calling, chatting, and setting up meetings with people in Contoso and vice versa. Then you also have guest access. Now, guest access gives access permission to an individual. Okay, so notice the difference here. External access for domains, external domains, guest access for individuals. So guest access allows a user to invite people from outside the organization to join a team. And those invited people get a guest account in Entra. Now, both guest and external access can be used at the same time in Teams meetings. So if for compliance and security reasons you want to limit access to Teams resources, you should consider using external access. See, with guest access, you do have to specify the capabilities, or you do have the capabilities to specify the level of restrictions to meet your compliance and security obligations. Things like deciding which teams a guest can be added to, or assessing the guest and grant access to a team based on what domain they're coming from. Maybe even deciding if the guest can access your teams and channels associated with your SharePoint site. Okay. Note that you can invite people outside your organization to Teams meetings without configuring external or guest access. But see, with external access, it makes it easy to find, call, chat, and even set up meetings with users from an entire external domain. Okay, so that's going to be the big piece that you'll want to remember with that. Okay. So you'll use this when you have different users in different domains that need to collaborate. Maybe you've got Rob at Contoso.com and then Anne at Fabricam.com. They're working together on a project, and along with some others in the Contoso.com and Fabricam.com domains. Great, that'd be a great choice for that. Maybe you want people in your organization to use Teams to contact people in specific businesses that are outside your organization, or you want anyone else to find and contact you using your email address in Teams. With guest access, once again, chat or invite people outside of your organization, individuals. Okay. Note that a team owner in Microsoft Teams can add and manage guests on their team. And so everyone on the team can easily identify who is a guest because you're going to get a little label that says guest next to their name and a tag in the upper right corner of the channel thread that indicates the number of guests on the team. So Teams does provide all of the collaboration features available in Office and SharePoint with persistent chat and a customizable and extensible set of collaboration tools in a unified user experience. And really, there are various settings that can affect sharing with people outside your organization for the Microsoft 365 workloads, like Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, you got SharePoint, you got OneDrive. So just remember, there's a lot of different little chunks that go into play in working with this. But the settings are located in Entra ID, Microsoft 365, also in the Purview Compliance Portal, Teams, and SharePoint Admin Centers. Now take a look here. If we look in the Entra ID Admin Center, this is going to control how users are invited to the directory and the guest experience at the directory, tenant, and application level. And so what sort of settings will this allow for? Well, they get guest user access. And so the properties and the memberships of those directory objects, right? So they also get guest invite settings, enables guest self-service sign up via user flows that you configure. It can allow for collaboration restrictions as well, and even working on shared channels, which we talked about yesterday. How about Purview? Purview. Well, that Microsoft Purview compliance portal, the administrators can use sensitivity labels to control guest access on Teams. And so teams created with a label that doesn't allow guest access are only available to users in your organization. See, people outside your organization can't be added to that team. But you can use the sensitivity labels to protect content in team sites, Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint sites with things like a privacy label of either public or private on those team sites and 365 groups. External user access and sharing from SharePoint sites, access from unmanaged devices, etc. At the Microsoft 365 level, see, Teams is going to use Microsoft 365 groups for team membership. And so the Microsoft 365 groups guest settings have to be turned on in order for guest access in Teams to work. So you can use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center to control things like let users add new guests to the organization, or let group owners add people outside of the organization to groups, or even let group members outside of your organization access group content. And so those are some options available. In Teams, you can you can control whether the guest experience is enabled or disabled for your Teams organization. And that setting is applied at the tenant level for Teams, but you can also configure permissions for guests in your Teams, like audio video settings, screen sharing capabilities. And so you can use the Teams admin center to control things like external access or guest access for things like calling, meetings, and messaging. And even anonymous user meeting experience can be configured. One last one that's listed on here is SharePoint, which also applies to OneDrive. Okay, so Teams content like files and folders and lists, they're all stored in SharePoint or in OneDrive, depending on where they've been shared out. Now, in order for the guests to have access to these items in Teams, the organization level SharePoint settings must allow for sharing with guests. Okay, so you do that through the SharePoint Admin Center and configure things like external sharing and file and folder links. You'll note there are a number of things that impact sharing of data, right? Variety of different tools, variety of different components that all work together. Now we have this thing that we talked about yesterday, known as shared channels, right? So shared channels in Microsoft Teams actually creates a collaboration space where you can invite people that are not in the team. Note that only the users who are owners or members of the shared channel can access the channel, but while guests, and so people with Entra ID guest accounts in the organization, can't be added to a shared channel, you can invite people outside your organization to participate in that shared channel by using the Entra B2B Direct Connect capabilities. Note that if you want to enable your users to collaborate with people outside your organization in shared channels, you do need to configure the B2B settings. Okay? It does have to happen. But when you enable shared channels and teams with another organization, well, then team owners in your organization will be able to invite people from other organizations to participate in shared channels. Your organization's custom line of business apps will be available in shared channels. External participants will be able to access them. Your organization's apps list will be available in shared channels, and then your external participants will be able to access them as well. Now, looking at this little diagram, this shows how the guest access authorization dependency is granted and integrated between the Entra environment, Microsoft 365, Teams, and SharePoint. And really, this dependency means that if you disable guest access at any one of these levels, well, you could create some restrictions and problems for those guest users. Okay, so you'll note maybe a user, we've got our Entra environment here, right? Entra, and so perhaps a user receives a invitation or they try to authenticate, and if they're the invitation or the authentication is denied, nope, no access, right? If, however, they're able to get themselves in either through invitation or through authentication, then Microsoft Teams is going to rely on Entra and Microsoft 365 groups external settings. If those are disabled, boom, guest addition has been denied. If, however, those are enabled, then great, we're going to look at guest authentication. Now, if guest authentication is not enabled, boom, guest addition is denied. However, if it's allowed, then look at across the board here. Is SharePoint external sharing allowed? Is Microsoft 365 group owners allowed to add guests? And Microsoft Teams apps, tabs, and bots, right? Are those allowed as well? If all of those are allowed across the board, woof, then guests can come in and start working. Right. Now, guests can leave the team at any time from within Teams, or owners can manually remove the guest accounts from their teams. But leaving the team doesn't remove the guest account from your organization's directory. That has to be done by a global admin in Microsoft 365 or in Entra. But as a Microsoft 365 global admin or Entra ID admin, you can remove a guest user from either the Microsoft 365 Admin Center or from the Entra ID Admin Center. Now, Entra ID is, as we talked about, the directory service that's used by Microsoft 365. And so the Entra ID relationships, settings directly affect things such as Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint, and OneDrive, right? They're all tied together, especially when using the Teams environment. And so when looking at something like external identity settings in Microsoft Teams, your external identities refer to all the different ways that you can securely interact with users outside of your organization. So if you want to collaborate with partners, distributors, suppliers, vendors, you can share your resources and then define how your internal users can access external organizations. So there are a few things to note in regards to that, a few different external identity settings for external collaboration experience in Teams. One of them being the external collaboration settings, right? So those external collaboration settings let you specify what roles in your organization can invite external users for B2B collaboration. And so there are things like guest user access or guest invite access. So you can specify who can invite guests. You can enable guest self-service sign up via a user flow. You can determine your collaboration restrictions or even allow and block domains. The other one that's listed here is configuring external collaboration in the Entra ID Admin Center. And so in the Admin Center, you can get in, you can take a look at under user settings, manage those external collaboration settings, note that, and then you can do all kinds of stuff in here, right? For guest user access, for the guest invites, for external user leave settings and how that's going to work, okay? So all of those sorts of settings can be configured in Entra ID. Just note that this is an old screenshot, right? And so there are a few extra changes that you'll note when you get in and you do your lab a bit later. You also have the ability to do cross-tenant access settings, right? So cross-tenant access settings are used to manage your B2B collaboration and B2B direct connect with external Entra ID organizations, including across different clouds. But your B2B direct connection is disabled by default. If you want to enable your users to collaborate with people outside your organization in shared channels in Teams, that does need to be configured. Okay? And so if you want to configure B2B direct, one of the things you configure is outbound access settings. Now, this is going to control whether your users can access resources in an external organization. Enable this setting to allow your users to participate in shared channels in other organizations. And then you've got your inbound settings as well to control whether users from external Entra ID organizations can access resources in your organization. And so enable this to allow users to invite people in other organizations to participate in shared channels. There are also some trust settings that you can configure to determine whether your conditional access policies will trust the MFA compliant device or even hybrid Entra ID join device claims from an external organization if their users have already satisfied the requirements in their own home tenants. Right? So if you're dealing with you're dealing with your own Entra ID tenant that has conditional access and another organization has their own Entra ID with conditional access, the user may have met the standards for theirs, but possibly not yours, right? So you can configure how that's going to work using the trust settings. Okay, and then enable shared channels with all external organizations is an option. So if your organization doesn't have a requirement to restrict collaboration with other organizations, then you can enable all organizations by default. That can save you time, complexity in managing in each one of the organizations separately. Okay. Or you can even get specific if you wanted to. So if your organization does have the requirement to restrict communication and collaboration with specific organizations, then you can do things like add that organization, configure the inbound settings, and configure the outbound settings for that collaboration. Now, the Microsoft 365 Admin Center has organization level settings for sharing and for Microsoft 365 groups. Okay, so you can get into the sharing settings through the Microsoft Admin Center and Microsoft 365 Admin Center through settings, org settings, security and privacy tab, and then under sharing, right? So put a little check in the box that says let users add new guests to the organization, okay? And then you've got that as a capability. Or for Microsoft 365 groups, you'll note let group owners add people outside your organization to Microsoft 365 groups as guests, and let guest group members access group content. Okay, so there's a couple of little check boxes there as well. And that is all found under the Microsoft 365 Admin Center under settings and org settings. So notice in both cases, it's under the org settings, Microsoft 365 groups. Remember, these settings are organization level components. In Microsoft Teams also, you can get in and configure external accesses. So external access is a way for Teams users from an entire external domain to find, call, chat, and set up meetings with you in Teams. Okay, you can also use external access to communicate with people from other organizations that might still be using older software as well. Okay? So note, people in my organization can communicate with Teams users whose accounts aren't managed by an organization is an option, right? And even allowing access for like Skype users as well. Now, with guest access, you can provide access to Teams, documents and channels, resources, chats, applications to people outside your organization. You got all kinds of fun stuff that you could share, right? Yet you still get to maintain control over that corporate data. So in order to configure guest access in Teams, you can, of course, use the Teams Admin Center like we just saw a moment ago, right? And so you can always go under the Teams Admin Center, under Users, under Guest Access, and choose to allow guest access in Teams. Turn that on. Also under Calling, Meeting, and Messaging, turn it on or off depending on the capability that you want them to have. Also, you can use PowerShell to configure and toggle guest access. PowerShell, right? So you'll notice this set-cs Teams guest, right? So for the most part, that's what it is. And then the rest of it will be a calling configuration, a meeting configuration, or a messaging configuration. So to allow a guest user globally, you can always run a PowerShell command, which is on here, set-cs Teams client configuration, right? This should be a, oops, there should be a space dash allow guest user $true, right? And so that's going to be run in against your Teams environment and will allow guest users. In fact, you can even do space dash identity global, right? So now we can turn on guest users globally. Then you can use the commandlets to set the level of access, like on guest calling, guest meetings, and guest messaging. Okay, so in my opinion, they should have reversed these, right? Put this one here at the top. And then once you've allowed for guest users, now you can do these other things. What sort of configurations will the guest users have access to? Teams content like files, folders, and lists, they're all stored in SharePoint. So in order for guests to have access to these items in Teams, well, then SharePoint organizational level sharing settings have to be enabled to support guests. And so the organization level settings determine what settings are available for individual sites, including sites associated with Teams. Remember, the files that you share in Microsoft Teams are either stored in SharePoint or they're stored in OneDrive. And so you'll note that under the SharePoint Admin Center, when you take a look at the sharing settings, content can be shared with SharePoint or OneDrive. Okay? Now, OneDrive can't be more permissive than SharePoint. Okay? SharePoint can be more permissive than OneDrive, but OneDrive cannot be more permissive than SharePoint. So you'll notice that you get some different settings like anyone, right? So users can share files and folders using links that don't require a sign-in. or new and existing guests. So a guest must sign in or provide some sort of verification code. Or only existing guests that are in our organization's directory. Lastly here, only people in your organization. So you've got a number of choices here. Pick the one that's going to work best for your organization. Okay, and just remember that if you drop down the one for SharePoint, the one for OneDrive is going to follow. Okay. However, OneDrive can be less sharing than SharePoint. Okay, but you cannot allow for more sharing than what's in SharePoint. Down below, you'll also note more sharing settings. So take the time to just kind of review this a bit. Understand that yes, there are still more things that I can configure to limit sharing from my organization. Because while we want the convenience of being able to share, we also don't want to overshare, right? We don't want to make it so permissive that we're now leaking data all over the place, right? Okay, how about security in Microsoft Teams? Implementing security. Well, we're going to talk a bit about this, configuring conditional access and MFA in Teams. We'll talk about safe links and safe attachments and how that works with Microsoft Teams and really what an awesome set of tools that is. And then a Defender tool known as the Defender for cloud apps and how that comes into play, monitoring your security reports in Teams, and then planning and configuring enhanced encryption policies. So really, Teams is that hub for teamwork in Microsoft 365 deployments, because we have to exchange confidential information from time to time, right? So applying, managing, and even administering security in Teams is paramount, right? We need to be concerned about that. So we're going to talk about all these things to help make Teams more secure. Now, one thing that you really want to focus on is this concept known as zero trust. Zero trust. Okay. Zero trust is exactly the way it sounds. Yeah, don't trust nothing. Right? I like to use the phrase pessimistic. It's a very pessimistic standpoint. But anymore, there are so many threats that are out there, so many things being exploited, you kind of have to be pessimistic, right? When it comes to security. So there's a framework known as the Zero Trust framework, and this concept of zero trust that Microsoft is working with. And so there are a few tenets that are associated with them, but one of them is verify explicitly, right? Verify every single access attempt. And it doesn't say authentication attempt. This is an access attempt, right? So access, if somebody's got a correct username and password and signs in, it doesn't necessarily mean it's that person. It could mean that their credentials were stolen, right? So keeping this in mind, when users connect to your team system using their device, they might inadvertently introduce security loopholes as well, right? Because the apps and the configurations present on that device just aren't good enough security-wise. So one of the things that we may want to look at, you'll notice here on the left, we've got these signals and where it says device, right? So bringing in our device, it's a risk. Well, there are signals that are used to validate a connection. And so conditional access is actually a feature of Entra ID, and it uses multiple signals. For example, who's the user? Where are they coming from? What's the time of day? What device are you using? Is the device updated? Is there malware associated with that particular device? What applications do they have on that box? What version of the application do they have on that box, etc.? See, there are bunches of different signals. And so you use conditional access policies to determine how trustworthy something is. Now, conditional access policies are basically just if-then statements that allow security professionals to provide a defense in-depth strategy, and they're enforced after the first factor authentication has been completed. So Microsoft Teams is supported separately as a cloud app in Entra conditional access policies. So that conditional access policy is made up of those statements of if-then statements of assignments and access controls. So the assignment part of the policy controls the who, the what, and the where of that access policy in conditional access. The access part of the policy controls how it's being enforced, right? And so based on the assignments, they may grant access, they may block access, or grant access provided one more additional condition is met, right? So you notice is verify every access attempt. Let's say that we're in the right spot at the right time, we got the right device, but actually wrong time of day, right? Wrong time of day. I don't normally sign in at 11:30 at night. Well, everything else is good. However, because of the fact that something's not right, we may not allow access right away. Perhaps we're going to require MFA, or we may reset the user's password, even block them, right? So one of the things that's really awesome about working with your Entra ID environment is conditional access. Take advantage of it, right? It's in there. Yes, it does cost extra, right? But conditional access can give an organization so much more security. Now, one of the pieces that we have in conditional access is the ability to support MFA. MFA, okay? And so MFA, or multi-factor authentication, is going to be that process of prompting a user for additional forms of authentication during sign-in, right? So maybe getting a code sent to their cell phone, perhaps scanning a fingerprint, scanning their face. But MFA dramatically decreases the chances of a user account being compromised. The recent number I heard was 99.9% drop. That's pretty big, right? So requiring MFA for all users it will significantly improve identity security for your organization. Okay, so MFA is definitely going to be a piece of this to prove that the user is who they say they are. But then you'll note for conditional access policy enforcement, right, as users are getting into access Teams, well, now this policy can be enforced early on. And so conditional access policies can be set for Teams, but because Teams is actually integrated with a bunch of other apps, right, to implement things like meetings and calendars and chats and file sharing, these conditional access policy can be enforced on those apps as well. So when a user does sign into Teams on any client, that conditional access policy that's set for Teams as well as any other cloud apps does get applied. Okay. So it's important to note that even though conditional access policies may be set up for Teams, without the correct policies on Exchange or SharePoint, users might still be able to access resources directly, right? So if you have a service dependency configured, well, the policy might be applied using early bound or late bound enforcement, meaning for early bound, a user must satisfy the dependent service policy before accessing the calling app. So for example, a user must satisfy SharePoint policy before signing into Teams. Okay. Late bound policy enforcement occurs after the user signs in to that calling app. And so enforcement is deferred when the calling app requests a token for downstream services like Teams accessing something like Planner. Okay. So yes, conditional access is important. Yes, it's very powerful, but it can be enforced at different times. But you got to remember too that you have multiple layers that Teams does work with, multiple apps that Teams works with. Okay. So you'll notice here that we can configure conditional access for Microsoft Teams and MFA. Okay, so maybe sign in to Entra and then under your services, look for conditional access, look for the Entra ID conditional access, and then on conditional access policy, create a new policy, okay? And then add things like a name, and then define the assignments like the users and groups that are going to be involved in this, any cloud apps that are going to be included like Microsoft Teams, right? So you could choose Microsoft Teams to be included as that cloud app for that. Okay. And so that you could pick the app and then choose whether or not you're going to grant. And if so, if you're going to grant access, how is it going to be enforced, right? Control user access enforcement to block or grant access. We're going to say use MFA, right? So you assign users, groups, cloud apps, or actions like the teams and the conditions that are going to take place for that if necessary. And then the access controls, if you're going to grant or block access. And if you're going to grant access, you can do something like allow for MFA. Now, one of the other really helpful features that you can work with is in Teams is the ability to upload files, right? I love being able to upload files, share screenshots, whatever the case is, in Teams. But if the file originated from a untrustworthy source, right? So let's say that a user said, hey, I downloaded this file from the internet and I want to share it with you guys. Well, that could be a security risk, right? So suppose in your firm of legal advisors, you're concerned that some Word documents might contain malicious macro code. Well, you want to intercept that malicious file that users exchange in Teams before they can compromise security. So safe attachments comes into play. Okay, that can prevent that malicious code from ever running and intercepting other forms of attacks. So what is safe attachments? Well, it's a feature of MDO, Microsoft Defender for Office. So it's another pay-for product, right? Microsoft Defender for Office 365. But see, safe attachments is going to help detect and even block files identified as malicious. Microsoft Teams does allow people to share files and collaborate, but Defender for Office 365 allows users to collaborate in a safe way. Right? The Microsoft Defender for Office 365 Safe Attachments feature protects the organization according to policies set by global or security administrators. So when a file in Microsoft Teams is identified as malicious, well, Defender for Office 365 will lock the file by integrating with the file store. And so you'll note here that we've got this file, Billing Contoso. We've got a little shield right there, right? So that image shows an example of a malicious file detected in a library. Now, although the blocked file is still listed in the library and in web, mobile, desktop applications, nobody can open it, copy it, move it, or share it, but they can delete it. Okay. So safe attachments for SharePoint, OneDrive, and Microsoft Teams is not enabled by default. So that is something that needs to be turned on. And you can turn it on using either the Microsoft Defender, Microsoft 365 Defender portal, right? Get all signed in, look under your global settings for policies and rules. For your policies, look for safe attachments. And then under those global settings, turn on the Defender for Office 365 for SharePoint, OneDrive, and Microsoft Teams. And many times when we think about safe attachments, we'll think about using that with email for exchange. However, it also works in conjunction with your SharePoint, OneDrive, and Microsoft Teams environments. PowerShell can also be used for this. You'll note set-ATP policy for O365. ATP was the old name. Advanced Threat Protection was the old name, right, for these tools. And so -enable ATP for SPO Teams ODB, right? So enable ATP for SPO, SharePoint Online, Teams, ODB, OneDrive for Business, $true. Okay, now just a note, between this 5 and this dash is a space. Okay. And so note, by default, people can download a blocked file. Global admins or SharePoint admins can prevent people from downloading malicious files by connecting to SharePoint Online PowerShell and then running set-SPO tenant space $disallow infected file download $true. Okay. So configuring safe attachments for Microsoft Teams, pretty easy thing to do. Just make sure you've got a subscription to Defender for Office 365. Same idea with safe links. Okay. This gives you that URL scanning and rewriting of inbound email messages in a mail flow, but also time of click verification of URLs and links in email messages as well as in Teams. See, safe links scanning can help protect your organization from malicious links that are used in phishing and other sorts of attacks. Okay, so safe links protection is available, of course, in email messages, which we typically think about. But then in Microsoft Teams, the safe links protection for links in Teams conversations, group chats, or from channels is also controlled by safe links policies. So you set up a safe links policy, and typically we're going to think of these policies, right? So we're in Defender Suite. We are going to set up a safe links policy. And of course, we think email first, because that's your most common input spot for malware. But then you'll notice you've got Microsoft Teams and other Office 365 apps listed here. Okay, so for Teams, if you turn it on, then Safe Links checks a list of known malicious links when users click links in Microsoft Teams. URLs are not rewritten, right? For email, they are rewritten by default. The links in Teams and for Office 365 will not be rewritten. So Safe Links protection for Office 365 is available as well. Okay. So how does Safe Links work at Teams? Well, users opens up Teams. Microsoft 365 verifies the user's organization, includes Defender for Office 365 or MDO, and that the user is included in an active Safe Links policy where protection for Microsoft Teams is enabled. Then any URLs get validated at the time of click for users in chats, group chats, channels, and tabs. Note that after you turn on Safe Links protection for Teams, URLs in Teams are checked against that list of known malicious links when the protected user clicks the link. Now, if the link was clicked in a Teams conversation, a group chat, or from channels, a warning page, like what you see here, will appear in the default browser window. Right? But if the link was clicked from a pinned tab, then the warning page will appear in the Teams interface in that tab. Okay, so depending on how the click protection settings in the policy were configured, the user will or will not be allowed to click through. Right, so you'll notice we've got a continue anyway option. So we've got click protection, track user clicks, let users click through to the original URL. So we have a few options there to help protect the users. Now, in order to get it enabled, you can configure the Safe Links policies in MDO, right, or through the Defender portal, or even by using PowerShell. Okay, so if you go through the Defender portal, look under your policies and rules. Under policies, look for Safe Links, and then create a policy there that's going to apply to the potentially malicious URLs within emails, but then also ones that are associated with Microsoft Teams. Okay, don't forget to also configure the click protection settings down below. Right, or you can also use Exchange Online PowerShell to help you out. Okay, so Safe Links policies can be turned on using Exchange Online PowerShell. So I could do a new -Safe Links policy or a set -Safe Links policy to make changes to a Safe Links policy that I already have. We also have Defender for Cloud Apps. And so apps in Microsoft Teams allow you to leverage additional capabilities. So that enhances your experience and makes Teams work for you by adding in Microsoft and third-party services that you like using. And so in modern business environment, users often want to use their own device to access your systems, right? So, hey, look, I'm using my iPad already, right? So They may want to download and use apps from app stores and other locations that you personally can't control directly because they're using their own device. That's one of the big ones, right? So you need to ensure that such practices don't put your sensitive and business critical data at risk. Defender for Cloud Apps can actually help you with that. And so Defender for Cloud Apps is going to be a cloud access security broker. You'll also hear it called a CASB, right? Cloud access security broker, it being a layer between the cloud apps and the users of those cloud apps. And so Defender for Cloud Apps is designed for security professionals who need to monitor activity centrally and also enforce security policies. And so Defender for Cloud Apps natively integrates with Microsoft solutions, right? Microsoft is going to play well with Microsoft. And so Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps is not an exception to that. So it gives you visibility into the apps being used, control over data travel, as well as analytics to identify and combat cyber threats. And so the Defender for Cloud Apps framework allows for you to discover and control the use of shadow IT. There's 30-some thousand different SaaS apps that are up on the site. So the Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps environment knows the different risks that are out there, okay? And the apps that could put your business at risk. A big piece of those in recent times are AI apps. So just putting that out there for you as well. Okay, so start managing them, these different apps that are out there to ensure security and compliance. Part of that cloud app framework as well is to protect your sensitive information anywhere in the cloud. So we can understand, classify, and even protect the exposure of sensitive information at rest. You can leverage the out-of-the-box policies and automated processes to apply controls in real time across all your cloud apps. Note that third bullet point to protect against your cyber threats and anomalies that are out there. See, this will help you to detect unusual behavior across cloud apps to look for things like ransomware, compromised users, any rogue applications. This will also help you to analyze high-risk usage and even remediate automatically to limit the risk to your organization. And the last one that's here on the list, to assess the compliance of your cloud apps. So this will help you to assess if your cloud apps meet the relevant compliance requirements that are included in regulatory compliance and industry standards. That means that this can help you to prevent data leaks to non-compliant apps and limit access to regulated data. And so there's a number of chunks that go into this architecture for the Defender for Cloud Apps. One of the big ones that you start with is cloud discovery. Cloud discovery is awesome because you use that to map and identify your cloud environment and the cloud apps that are in use in your organization. Then you have the power to sanction or unsanctioned apps. So apps should be sanctioned or unsanctioned after you've reviewed the list of discovered apps in your environment. So you can secure your environment by approving or sanctioning safe apps or prohibiting or unsanctioning unwanted apps. In regards to app connectors, you could deploy app connectors that use the APIs of app providers to give visibility and control by Defender for Cloud Apps over the apps that you want to connect to. You also have conditional access app control. So this will give you real-time protection, visibility, and control over access and activities within your cloud apps. So session controls in Defender for Cloud Apps work with the featured apps that are part of what you're using. And lastly, your policies. This will enable you to define the way that you want users to behave in the cloud. So you can look for things like risky behavior, any violations, suspicious data points and activities in your cloud environment. And if necessary, you can integrate remediation workflows to achieve complete risk mitigation. Now, to allow featured apps to be controlled by Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps in conditional access app control, you'll need to configure an IDP, an identity provider, to work with Defender for Cloud Apps. And this could be something like Entra ID. You can sign into each app with a user scoped in the policy. You then verify the apps are configured to use access and session controls, and then lastly, test the deployment. Note you do need to have Entra Premium P1 or higher for that. Okay. And then for policy control, use policies to define how you want your users to work out. But this will also to help you to define the types of policies that correlate to different types of information you want to gather about your cloud environment. Like, for example, maybe you want to quarantine a data violation threat, or perhaps block a risky cloud app from being used in your organization. These policies are super powerful. And for things that at one point were not possible, Defender for Cloud Apps really can help. Your Microsoft security reports for Teams. In the Defender portal, it provides reports to let you see the threats in your organization. So even though the threat security report may not be directly related to Teams, suspicious activities can still be noted. So for example, under the general security reports, right? So Defender portal has that dashboard that displays security trends and also tracks the protection status of your identities, data, devices, apps, and infrastructure. And so to view the report in the Defender portal, you can go to Reports and Security and take a look at the security reports there for things such as data. Okay, so the data is the reporting the data from multiple sources, like users with the most shared files, or DLP policy matches, or false positives, or even overrides. For your identities, okay, this category of the report gives you data from the Entra ID Risky Users Report. Okay, and so reports are related to Teams because sign-in activity to Teams can be coming from different types of devices, right? So you want to know where they're coming from. And speaking of devices, that's yet another report, right? So it provides data from Microsoft Intune. So there's yet another service to think about. Microsoft Intune on devices at risk, or device threat analytics, device and compliance, malware on devices, et cetera, et cetera. And those, oops, go back here. And so those particular reports are really useful for Teams because large numbers of mobile devices where Teams is installed may mean that you've got some sort of other threat going on. You also have apps as another one of your reports. Okay, this comes from Defender for Cloud Apps. So helping you to see the different types of apps you have, maybe privileged OAuth apps, suspicious admin activity, and things like that. And they're related to Teams because different types of apps that are integrated in with Microsoft Teams. So you're able to see, okay, what's going on with SharePoint or what's going on with OneDrive and stuff like that. So you can also take a look at your URL protection report and see how that's been happening, right? Look at URL clicks by application. And then for threat protection report, malware protection, right? So if there's been any malware in email delivery, what policies and stuff as well have been protecting it. So is it email malware or phishing? Is it content malware, right? Is it spam? So you're able to see threat protection and URL threat protection as well. So lots of reports that are available in the Defender environment. Okay. Now, planning and configuring enhanced encryption policies. We like to have end-to-end encryption, or E2EE, and this happens when content is encrypted before it's sent and decrypted only when received by the intended recipient. So with end-to-end encryption, only the two endpoint systems are involved in encrypting and decrypting the call data. No other party, including Microsoft, can get in and decrypt that particular conversation. So end-to-end encryption for a one-to-one Teams calls, right? So with end-to-end encryption, only those two endpoints are involved. No other parties are part of it. And note that data exchange during the calls is always secure while in transit and at rest. Just note, end-to-end encryption isn't available if your organization uses compliance recording. Right? So what is encrypted? Well, during an end-to-end encrypting call, teams will secure the audio, the video, the screen sharing, but some things are not available. Advanced features aren't available during an E2EE call. Live captions and transcription, call transfers, merges, parks, consult and transfer, call companion and transfer to another device, adding a participant and recording. Okay. But Teams admin can enable end-to-end encryption for the organization by creating one or more enhanced encryption policies. Okay, and so these policies are global and organization-wide default policies. Okay, and that is disabled by default. Okay, so you can always get in and enable it if you wanted to, or you can create a custom policy. And so you can create a new encryption policy, or you can modify the global default policy if you wanted to. So that can be done through the Teams Admin Center, through enhanced encryption policies, and get that configured. Or PowerShell can be used to help you out. Okay. So you'll note that we've got a variety of different commands with PowerShell. One of the first ones is get-cs Teams Enhanced Encryption Policy. This is information about the Teams Enhanced Encryption policies already in place in your organization. You have the grant-cs Teams Enhanced Encryption Policy that's here. This is going to assign or unassign existing enhanced encryption policies to a user. If you want to unassign, use $null in that particular command to unassign all policies from a user. New-cs Teams Enhanced Encryption Policy, pretty obvious, right? Creates a new Teams Enhanced Encryption Policy. Remove-cs Teams Enhanced Encryption Policy will delete an enhanced encryption policy from your organization. Note, you cannot delete the default policy, okay? And then the last one here, set-cs Teams Enhanced Encryption Policy to make any changes to an already existing encryption policy. And then to enable end-to-end encryption for the entire tenant, by setting the default global policy, you do a set-cs Teams Enhanced Encryption Policy commandlet. Okay, so that will allow you to turn that on. To place end-to-end encrypted calls in Teams clients, see, after all that's turned on, users will need to switch on end-to-end encrypting calls in Teams settings on their device. Note that each user needs to complete the task, but they only need to do it on one device. So Teams will synchronize the setting across all the supported endpoints for each user, getting that particular feature enabled. All right, now we're going to take a 5-minute break, and when we come back at quarter till, we will take a look at implementing compliance for Microsoft Teams. I'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Thanks. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully that little 5-minute break was good for you and you feel good and ready to go. Now let's keep on going, shall we? Got a bit more to talk about today. We're going to talk about compliance in Microsoft Teams. Compliance. Okay, so some things that we're going to talk about: sensitivity labels. We're going to talk about using Purview a bit. All right, so we're going to talk about sensitivity labels. We'll discuss as well your retention policies and how those work, generating data loss prevention policies to protect against things like data leakage, communication compliance for reviewing communications, activate the scoped directory search in Teams. Right, so that's something we'll take a look at, describe how information barrier policies work and then how to create them, and lastly, configure alert policies for events in Microsoft Teams. So lots of tools that are part of working with the Purview platform. And really that Microsoft Purview compliance portal will help you to ensure that Teams usage complies with government and industry regulations and standards, as well as the standards that are implemented in your organization. So when we think about sensitivity labels, this gives you a way to classify and then protect your data. And so Microsoft Information Protection Framework utilizes the sensitivity labels feature. Okay, so make sure that users stay productive, their ability to collaborate isn't going to be hindered either. But sensitivity labels allows Teams admins to regulate access to sensitive organizational content that's created during collaboration within Teams. So organizations can use those sensitivity labels to provide protection settings that include things like encryption, content markings, protect content in Office apps across platforms and devices. They can protect content in third-party apps and services by utilizing Defender again, right? The Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps features. Protecting containers that include Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint sites, sensitivity labels for Power BI, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many things that can be protected. And so when you create a sensitivity label, you're asked to configure the label's scope. Now, the label scope is going to determine a couple of different things: which label settings you can configure for that label and where the label will be visible to others. And so, for example, you could say, hey, this is going to be for files and emails. So email and Office 365 files. It could be for groups and sites, right? So it could be Microsoft team sites. It could be 365 groups, SharePoint sites, or you could even say something like a schematized data asset. And so things that are discovered through the Purview data map and protecting data that's in Azure SQL or SQL Server, et cetera. So we have sensitivity labels. And so the sensitivity labels can be applied at the item level, like at files and email levels, or even containers like team sites, 365 groups, SharePoint sites. If you're looking at container level classification and protection, you can use the following label settings: privacy, either public or private, of team sites and Microsoft 365 groups, external user access, external sharing from SharePoint sites, access from unmanaged devices, authentication contexts, default sharing links for a SharePoint site, or even site sharing settings. Right? So when you're defining the settings for your privacy labels or your sensitivity labels, there is so much stuff to think about. Where are we going to use this? And so when it comes to privacy and external user access, you can configure the privacy and external user settings, right? So if you go to privacy, right? So as you're building your new sensitivity label under groups and sites, this will be your files, your individual items. Then you've got privacy and external user access. You have public. Okay, so public is one of your options. You can keep the default of public if you want anyone in your organization to access the team site or group where this label is going to be applied. Or you could set it to private if you want to allow or restrict to only members that are approved in your organization, or select none if you want the content in the container to be to be secured by using that sensitivity label, but still letting users configure the privacy setting themselves, right? So team and group members can set their own privacy settings on that particular component. And so when you apply a sensitivity label to a supported container, then that label automatically applies the classification and protection settings to the connected site or group. And so content in those containers, however, do not inherit the labels for the classification and settings like visual markings or encryption. Okay, so make sure you've enabled sensitivity labels for Office files in SharePoint and in OneDrive so that users can label their documents in SharePoint sites or in Team sites. Okay, so that's just a good little thing to note. So you can automatically assign that label to files and emails when it matches conditions that you specify. Hey, that's kind of cool, right? So you can automatically apply a sensitivity label to content based on conditions. When it comes to enabling sensitivity labels for groups and sites, the configuration options for site and group settings don't display until you enable that capability. So in your Entra ID environment, right, you turn that on there. In Windows PowerShell, connect to Entra, and then make sure you set the properties that are associated with that. Okay, so you configure a directory setting. Okay, then you can take those sensitivity labels and publish them, so your global admins can create and manage those sensitivity labels from the Microsoft Purview compliance portal. Okay, and so they can pop into the compliance portal under information protection and then configure the settings for sensitivity labels under labels. Okay, so they can create a label, a new sensitivity label. You can do tooltips and all kinds of stuff associated with those labels. Once those labels are created, then you can publish them, make them available to start using. And one of the things to note is that those sensitivity labels in some cases can be usable with Microsoft Teams. So admins can create sensitivity labels that, when applied to or during team creation, allows users to create teams with a specific privacy. So for example, an admin creates a sensitivity label called confidential with the policy that any team that's created with this label must be a private team. In other words, you're going to have to manually invite people in there. So when a user creates a new team and selects the confidential label, the only privacy option that's available to the user is private. Other things like public or org-wide are going to be disabled. So very powerful settings that are part of working with your Purview environment. Then when that team is created, the sensitivity label is visible in the upper right-hand corner of the channels in that team. Then when you apply a sensitivity label to a supported container, that label automatically applies the classification and protection settings to the connected site or group. But just as a reminder, it does not apply to what's inside that container. But when working with sensitivity labels for Microsoft Teams Premium is going to bring sensitivity labels and policies together with other sorts of configurable meeting features. So depending on how an organization configures its labels, Teams Premium will apply a templatized set of designated meeting options designed to enhance security and compliance. Some of the options: who needs to wait in the meeting lobby? Who needs to ask to join a meeting? Or calendar labels like do not forward, enforcing automatic recording, restricted copy and paste from a meeting chat, advanced encryption control for audio video streams, and even some watermarking on content and video. So lots of options at your disposal there. Now, the volume and complexity of organization data keeps on increasing, from emails to documents to chats and stuff like that. And by default, Teams chat, channel, and files are going to be retained indefinitely unless somebody deletes the content, right? either manually or via retention policy, right? So retention policies and retention labels, you'll notice there's a difference. Sensitive information types and sensitive information policies, right? And your sensitivity labels and your retention policies, right? So one has to do with retaining data, the other one has to do with treating data as a particular level of sensitivity. But your retention policies and labels from Microsoft 365 actually help you to more effectively manage the information in your organization. So Teams does support retention policies for chat and channel messages, right? And so I know it's happened to me where I start a chat, and then, you know, depending on the policy, I may see several weeks or even a couple months down the line, all these chats have been removed due to organizational policy. So you can decide proactively whether you want to retain, delete, or retain data for a specific period of time and then delete it. And so when you get in, you actually build a retention policy in Purview. You could choose where this is going to apply, from Exchange to SharePoint, even into Teams. Now, a retention policy could support multiple locations. Note, you can't create a single retention policy that includes all supported locations. See, Teams requires a retention policy that's separate from other workloads. So that means you have to create a specific retention policy for Teams chats or channel messages. Note that you can apply a Teams retention policy to the entire organization, and you can configure unique policies that apply to specific users or teams in your organization. So you'll notice an included and an excluded that's listed here. Okay. You can also set up separate retention policies for private chats and channel messages. Okay, so you'll note even Teams private channel messages is listed here. So there are a variety of different types of retention policies that can be put on Teams. And then when looking at your retention settings, those policies will help you to hold to your organization's internal policies or internal regulation, your industry regulations, your legal needs, and delete stuff that's considered a liability, stuff that you're no longer using anymore. Okay, and so you can go in and configure the retention settings of the policy and choose how long you're going to retain it. Retain items for a specific period and start the retention period based on. Okay, so you'll know your data, or you should know your data if you're building this out. How long does it need to be held, and when does that time period start? Okay, lots of times you're going to see when items were created. You may also see when items were last modified. Okay. And then at the end of the retention period, maybe we want to delete items automatically or do nothing. However, that means you're going to receive a little message on that, right, in your Purview environment. You also have retain items forever. So even if a user deletes them, well, it's not actually truly deleted. Okay. Or only delete items when they reach a certain age. So note that your items won't be retained, but when they reach the age you choose, they'll be deleted from where they are stored. Okay, so you can configure those sorts of retention settings. Okay, so retention, when you think about retention, depending on the data that you're looking at, it's going to have different retention requirements. Okay? Not all data is created equally. Now, one of the things you could do is as you can see here, you could do the create retention policies in that Purview center, right? Purview Admin Center. It used to be called the Compliance Center. Now it's the Purview Admin Center. And then you can also use PowerShell to create a new retention compliance policy. Okay. With all of these things, right, with all these different commands, there's going to be a bunch of parameters associated with them. Take the time to understand what those parameters are going to do in order to build out appropriate policies. One other thing to look at is DLP policies. This is going to help you to identify, monitor, and automatically protect sensitive information across your Microsoft 365 environment. And so DLP policies are really awesome. These data loss prevention policies, they ensure that sensitive data does not get lost, misused, or accessed by unauthorized users. And so this will help you to identify that sensitive information no matter what the location is, to prevent the sharing of that information on accident, to monitor and protect that sensitive information in the desktop versions of Excel, PowerPoint, Word, and you can even take the time to review some reports. If you're going to turn on stuff like DLP, guess what? Good idea to review the reports so you can know what it is that you need to work on, right? What sorts of things you need to correct. Now, if you're using DLP policy for Teams, you can define the policies for Teams for channels or for chats. And so DLP for Microsoft Teams will block sensitive information or sensitive content when shared with Microsoft Teams users who have guest or external access. Okay, so some examples: protecting sensitive information in messages. You'll notice what we've got here, right? MOD administrator got a message. Look at this: typhoid meningitis, social security number, blah, blah, blah. What can I do? The message was blocked. Your message was blocked because it contained sensitive information. Here's what you can do, right? Override the policy and send a message, or report it to the admin if you think it was blocked in error, right? So this keeps that sensitive data, and you've got the capability to put in what you feel is sensitive information. There are tons of sensitive information types already part of working with the Purview environment. So social security numbers and stuff like that are all part of that. Okay. So it'll help protect the sensitive information in your chats. It'll help protect your sensitive information in your documents. And yeah, so it's a very powerful tool. So DLP is like one of those things that organizations really need to look at because they don't want their confidential data being spilled out. And really, you do have the flexibility in how you create and configure your DLP policies. Now, you can start from a predefined template and then create a policy in just a few clicks, or you can start all over again, creating your own custom policy. So yes, you can take advantage of a predefined policy template or pick your own stuff. It will take a little time for you to build it out if you decide you're going to do a custom policy. But no matter what you choose, you need to choose what you're going to monitor, right? And then choose where you want to monitor, so the policy locations, also the conditions that must be matched for a policy to be applied to that particular item. Okay. So the type of data, if it maybe has a specific sensitivity label, so you'll notice sensitivity labels can come into play with this as well. Then the action that you want to take, right? So for example, the actions depend on the location where the activity is happening. So for example, if it's in SharePoint or Exchange or OneDrive, maybe we want to block people outside the organization from accessing that content. And we may show a user tip and send them an email notification that they're taking an action that's prohibited by DLP. Right? Or maybe if it's in Teams chat or a channel, we might block that sensitive information from being shared into that chat or channel. Okay? But those conditions and those actions to take are defined in an object known as a rule. Those rules enforce a specific protection requirement, and that DLP policy is used to group together common protection requirements into one policy. And so when creating those DLP policies for Microsoft Teams, you can go into the Purview Center and then configure the DLP policy from there. It's going to show up as one of your available services right there in Purview, and easy enough to build out that new policy, define all the settings for that rule, etc. Okay, including where it's going to take place or where it's going to have effect, such as if you're going to apply it to Microsoft Teams. Something to note is when you get into the spot towards the end, which is on test or turn on the policy, one of the things that you have is an option to test it out first. It doesn't enforce it. You can choose to show policy tips while it's in test mode. Okay, so when it's in test mode, it's basically in logging mode. It's in an audit mode. This is a great way to start, right? So that you can know what it is that's going to be blocked. Okay. Communication compliance as well. Okay, so communication compliance does help minimize communication risks to detect, capture, and act on inappropriate messages, right? So this could be bad language, this could be threat, this could be hate speech. And you'll notice somebody put in here a message, I'm going to hurt myself, and I hope you'll regret it until you die, right? Wow, that's pretty harsh stuff right there. And so what can I do? Right? Well, that message was blocked. Someone doesn't get to see the message, and it was blocked due to an admin policy. So your communication compliance allows for you to block certain types of content and then also look at user activity. In fact, for remediation, we can also escalate to others as well. Okay. So great stuff to do to keep our organization from having HR issues with what happens in the Teams environment. Okay. Microsoft Teams also has the scoped directory search, so that allows organizations to create virtual boundaries that control how users can find and communicate with other users in the organization. And so Microsoft Teams lets organizations do custom views of the directory to their own users, right? So there are some prerequisites, or this is actually the prerequisite to using what's known as the information barrier policy, which we'll talk about next. But let's say an organization has multiple companies in a single tenant, and you want to segment searches by company. So if somebody's typing in a name to look for, it's only going to look in their respective company. Or perhaps a school wants to limit chats between faculty and students, right? Well, that's a type of barrier that we can implement. Okay. So you can build address book policies, but address book policies provide only a virtual separation of users from the directory perspective. Any user data that has already been cached will still remain available to users for 30 days. So you can turn on Scope Directory in your Teams Admin Center under Teams Settings. Moving on to information barrier policies, right? Or IBs. These are policies that an admin can configure to prevent individuals or groups from communicating with each other, such as searching for a user, adding a member to a team, or starting a chat session with someone, starting a group chat, inviting someone to join a meeting, sharing a screen, placing a call, sharing a file with another user, accessing access to file through sharing links, right? So you could turn on information barriers, right? And so that keeps people from communicating with each other. Now, let's say they already had a communication going. We've turned on information barriers. Boom, administrator has disabled chat for this user. Okay. So really interesting that all of these things are in place. Okay. And so some prereqs for making these information barriers, like let's say you've got two different departments, two different roles of individuals, like the teacher and the student, or faculty and students. We don't want them to have to communicate directly with each other. Great, that information barrier comes into place. So think about what you need barriered first, right? And so one thing, you do need to have the right licensing. And Microsoft 365 E5 or Office 365 E5, etc. Make sure you study the licensing that's associated with this. Permissions for information barrier settings. So you do need to be a GA, right? Global admin, a compliance administrator as well. Make sure that you have access to your organization structure, right? And that structure is reflected in directory data. You turned on that setting for scoped directory search. That audit logging has been turned on. That's something you do configure in Purview. That you don't have any Exchange phone book or address book policies in place. And then, then what do you do? Well, now you start segmenting, right? So in part 1, segment your users. And so during that phase, determine what information barrier policies are needed, make a list of the segments that you define, and then define your segments. And so when segmenting users, remember a user must be in only one segment, and that each segment must have only one information barrier. So that segment is defined by certain directory attributes. So to assign users to a segment, you use the new-organization segment commandlet, okay, to get that configured. After you do that, then you define your information barrier policies, okay? And so note that you use the new-information barrier policy commandlet. So there are 2 different types of policies. One is block communications. Okay, that's going to prevent one group from communicating with another, or allow communications, and that's going to allow a group to communicate with only certain specific other groups, right? So you have either the dash segments blocked or dash segments allowed. The last one, once you build it all out, okay, then part 3, you apply those information barrier policies, right? And so you can use the get dash information barrier policy to see which ones you already have in place, but to set a policy to an active status, use the set dash information barrier policy commandlet with the identity parameter, and then set the state parameter dash state to active. Okay. And then after you do that, then you can start doing the start dash information barrier policies application. Okay, and so that's gonna, you set it in place, now it's there, now you can turn it on, basically is what it is. Give it at least a half an hour to start applying to your organization. Note that the system will apply or process about 5,000 user accounts per hour. So you'll note with your example they have here, they're preventing bankers from communicating with financial and preventing financial from communicating with bankers. Okay, and then you can also turn on alert policies, right, to monitor user activities. So alert policies help to identify events in their tenants that could lead to a security breach or even abuse of administrative privileges or other activities that do require monitoring. And so those alert policies can be configured in Microsoft Purview. Okay, let's talk networking briefly. Right, so configuring components for your network to make sure that things are going to work for Microsoft Teams. Teams is part of the Microsoft 365 experience. It's built on core cloud computing capabilities. So yeah, it does still need to live on a network. And you need to have a network that's going to be able to support Teams network traffic for data between Microsoft 365 Online and a Teams client, for peer-to-peer real-time communication, and even for conferencing real-time communication. That includes audio, video, and desktop sharing. For your network requirements, you do need connectivity to the Microsoft 365 environment. No firewall, no proxy blockers, and all DNS names that are being used by Teams do need to be unstopped, right? You need to have at least one verified domain name for your organization and have the throughput to support the bandwidth to support it. Okay. Then you've got network optimization. And so notice optional guidance to optimize your network and Teams performance is listed here. Okay, so this is a good idea. Get in there and start taking a look at some of the components. We'll talk about some of these, like external name resolution, a valid NAT pool size. You don't want to run out of that. Configuring split tunnels and bypassing proxy servers are all things that you could think about for network optimization. Note the bandwidth requirements. All I'm going to say is this is going to be a good chart for you to review in advance of your exam. Okay. This is all in your curriculum that you have as well. Okay, so for example, bandwidth requirements, this is bitrate kilobits per second up and down. Okay, for audio or 1-to-1, minimum 10 down up and 10 down. Recommended 58 up and 58 down. Best performance 76 up, 76 down. You notice it when you start going to video and screen sharing. Now you're looking at 4,000 up, 4,000 down. And this is per connection, right? So just note some of these network requirements and planning accordingly. Now, a network planner, right? So we got network planners, part of Teams here. It's designed to assist an admin to determine and organize network requirements for connecting teams for users across an entire organization. So when you're in the Teams admin center, under planning, look for that network planner. Okay, this is going to generate the reports, calculate bandwidth requirements for Teams usage, and even create representations of your organization using sites and Microsoft recommended personas. Microsoft recommended personas. So there's some in here like a Teams room system, a remote worker, an office worker. You can also create other ones as well, custom personas. So this will help you to plan out your network configuration. Now, all clients that use Office 365 cloud-based services, including Teams, need to connect to the Office 365 endpoints. Okay, and those are going to represent a set of destination IP addresses, DNS domain names, and URLs for Office 365 traffic out on the internet. Okay, Microsoft documents all of that stuff, so feel free to do a search for that. You'll see a list of things that need to be communicated with and what should be left open. In other words, don't try to block that particular traffic. So when we're looking here, you'll notice for your Office 365 endpoint change management, we've got web services, RSS feeds. You can even use Power Automate to help you out with this. But notice our scenarios, right? If we've got non-real-time traffic, the source IP or port, the IP is the client IP, and the port is going to be high ports, right? So high numbered ports that are going to be used to connect to those destination locations. So for example, for Office 365 is going to be the destination IP, one of the IPs that's used for it, and for 80 and 443. Now, if we're doing real-time media traffic, well, it's going to start with the client IP, so that's the source IP, and 50,000 to 50,059 UDP traffic. Okay. When that's bound for, or the destination will be to any of the transport relays using ports 3478 through 3481 UDP. Okay, so that traffic should not be blocked. And QoS is something that we could think about. So QoS in Microsoft Teams, or quality of service in Teams, allows real-time network traffic that's sensitive to network delays, like voice or video streams, to cut in line in front of traffic that's less sensitive, like downloading apps or something like that. But QoS provides a way for more effectively managing the resources you have instead of adding bandwidth, right? So prioritizing traffic is basically what it's down to. And so this can help with things like jitter or packet loss, or even a delayed round trip time, right? Your RTT. Those media packets may take a long time to reach your destination. And so if that's the case, well, it can be pretty darn noticeable, right? So implementing QoS can really help out an organization to handle what they already have. So first off, verify if your network is ready for QoS. And second, select the desired QoS implementation method that you might want to use. Third is to choose the initial port ranges for each media type. 4, implement your QoS settings on your clients, your routers, and in the Teams admin center. And number 5, make sure it works. Verify that it works. Okay, validate the QoS implementation by looking at the traffic. Now, someone may say, well, how do I verify if my network is ready? Well, your network devices must have a way to classify traffic and must be able to distinguish voice or video traffic from other sorts of network traffic. You've got the ability to use call analytics. Call analytics shows call and meeting quality for individual users in Teams. Hey, quality is really important, isn't it? And so location enhanced call analytics reports contain the location names instead of just an IP subnet. So that makes the reports easier to understand and to use for remediating any potential issues. So you'll note in the little report they're showing here, we'll see that we've got who the owner is, what the building is, what city and zip code is coming from, what the state is and region, Look at all that information that's contained in there. Your reporting labels are what are being used in your organization to indicate physical locations of offices, buildings, or those organizational sites. And the reporting labels page in the Teams Admin Center lets you provide a text file containing a list of physical locations and their subnets. So it'll make your document easier to read. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to prepare a data file. And so the report labels and locations come from us. They're put into either a TSV or a CSV file and are uploaded into the Teams Admin Center for reporting labels. Okay, once that file is uploaded, then it starts getting used in the reports. Okay. We also have the CQD, or the call quality dashboard. This is a network-wide view of call quality across your organization. And so location enhanced CQD reports help the network engineer to determine if the problem is a site-related issue. So for example, you could include different building locations or endpoint specific views like wired or Wi-Fi connected devices, but the data can be assessed to determine if the problem is isolated to a single user or affects a larger segment of users. And so to turn on building or endpoint specific views in CQD, an admin has to upload building or endpoint information on the CQD tenant data upload page. Tenant data upload, right? And so now they can take that file, either TSV or CSV. Note that the data file doesn't include a table header row. The first line of the data file is expected to be data itself, right? So make sure you prepare the file correctly. And so there are two different types of data files that you can build, either building or endpoint. But once you get into the Teams Admin Center, then you could choose to do a tenant data upload for either building or endpoint. Now we can also use a tool to help us out at connectivity.office.com to help us out to see if our network is ready for Microsoft Teams. Okay. The results from the tool can be used as part of a network assessment to determine if a customer network is most optimal for working with Teams, and even provide some suggestions. Note that when you run the tool, if you get some results back, look for things like media connectivity, that it can use UDP. Packet loss is less than 1% during a 15-second window. Latency is less than 100 milliseconds, and jitter is less than 30 milliseconds. Okay, so those are some recommendations there. But it's good to run this tool so that you don't end up with something underperforming right out of the box and then think that there's a problem with Teams. Right? If the network's not ready, you might have to do some other stuff first to get things ready to go. Then once you get your network connectivity results, you can share it with others. Right? So you'll notice you get some output. You've got some beautiful little maps and graphs that are part of this. And one of the things that you'll have in the upper right-hand corner is the ability to share with others. So sharing with others who sign in to the same tenant as yours, or you can also copy a link to send to others. There's also the Microsoft Teams Network Assessment Tool. Okay, that gives you the ability to perform a simple test of network performance and network connectivity. It's a tool you can get by Microsoft, from Microsoft, to help you to determine things like output loss, jitter, round trip time during a packet exchange. Okay, so for network performance, this will allow for you to do tests for Microsoft Teams clients, right? Streaming packets to the nearest edge site just to see how long it's going to take and what the traffic looks like. Network connectivity itself, this will verify network and network elements between the test location and the Microsoft network are correctly configured to enable communication to IP addresses and ports that are needed for Microsoft Teams calls. Like, is there anything blocking communication? And you can also run the Microsoft Teams Network Assessment Tool, the network assessment tool.exe file that you can get from Microsoft. Okay, so using that tool, You can get it from the Microsoft website. If you want to test out network performance, so network connectivity, run the tool on its own for performance, network assessment tool.exe /quality check. Okay? And that'll help you to get an idea of what's going on. Now, if your organization is deploying location-based routing for direct routing or dynamic emergency calling, then you have to configure network settings for use with these cloud voice features in Microsoft Teams. Okay, so depending on the cloud voice feature and the capability you're deploying, you configure some things like the network region. So the network region is going to be a collection of network sites. And so that would be like the geographic location, right? A network site represents a location where your organization has a physical venue, maybe an office, maybe a campus or a set of buildings. But those network sites are defined as a collection of IP subnets, and each network site must be associated with a network region. And then you have your network subnets. So each subnet has to be associated with a specific network site. So a client's location is determined based on the network subnet and the associated site. So you can actually have multiple subnets with the same network site, but you cannot associate multiple sites in the same subnet. So you got your network sites. You also have trusted IP addresses that can be configured. And those are going to be the internet external IP addresses of the enterprise network. Okay. And then you can configure the roaming policies as well. Okay, so for users that are out and about, that you know, in addition to managing the video and media settings with media policy and those meeting policies, you can dynamically control the use of IP video and media bitrate using the Teams client by using the Teams network roaming policy, which enables you to assign settings to network sites themselves. Okay, so when the Teams client signs in from a network site with a roaming policy assigned, that particular policy will apply. And then managing the network topology, note you can use PowerShell to help you out. You could do a new-CS Teams network roaming policy. New-CS Teams network roaming policy. This will allow for you to define the tenant and then things such as the allow IP video, whether that's true or false, the media bit rate in kilobits as well. Then you can also create, IT admins can create policies for network roaming and bandwidth control, right? But you can also configure ECDN settings, right? So Microsoft ECDN settings, and the setup has some networking requirements like external connections. So connections that go out to the internet, usually those packets in these connections go through the firewall and need allow listing, right? So if you're going to take advantage of an ECDN, then that's the case. If you're looking at an internal connection, the connections that remain inside the corporate network, usually packets through those connections don't go through a firewall, wouldn't need any configuration to allow for those either. Okay, so just a couple of extra things to think about when doing your configuration for Microsoft Teams. You do have some homework after this, right? Basically, going back through most of this information, right? Controlling guest access, B2B access, spend some time with B2B. B2B is actually really, really awesome when configuring that for Microsoft Entra, right? And then security for Microsoft Teams, we're looking at things like conditional access, spend some time with that. Licensing, yep, got to spend more time with that too. Defender XDR, see how that comes into play with Microsoft Teams. Then when it comes to compliance, this has to do with Purview. And so looking at Purview for alert policies, retention policies, sensitivity labels, information barriers, insider risk and communication compliance, DLP. And then network settings, looking at things like your network planner, your network assessment tool, your Microsoft 365 connectivity test tools, and you have the lab on preparing your environment for a Microsoft Teams deployment. Well, this is going to conclude day 2 of the MS-700 course on Microsoft Teams. Hope you have a great evening. Thank you and take care.